talking about the two halves of my career. One does pertain to psychic spying, and the other, more recently, pertains to spiritual activities, investigations. My background is in remote sensing, and I've done remote sensing with lasers to look at wind shear and air turbulence, and remote sensing with ESP to look into the Soviet Union and the far reaches of the civilized and uncivilized world during the Cold War. And let me tell you, the ESP works better because the lasers don't work worth a damn when it's raining or the fog comes in, and the fog doesn't interfere with psychic abilities at all. Now, what I've discovered during my many years in industrial science, and a lot of that has been in aerospace, is that even scientists have an inclination that there is something in the spiritual world beyond the ordinary materiality of their lives. They don't know what it is, and it scares them, but they're aware that there is something else going on. For example, they notice that spiritual people seem to be happier than the TikTok engineers working at the bench, and they don't really know why. It's as though we have a choice to be pessimists or optimists. The pessimists are very astute. They notice that there's fighting in Bosnia and in Pakistan and in Peru and in Rwanda. There's fighting all over the place, and we live in a very dangerous world, not to say anything about pollution and the other things. And the astute person notices that things are really quite dangerous, and this gives him causes for great concern. The optimist is happy to be alive, gives thanks every morning that he's awakened with his consciousness and his awareness. If he looks up and sees that the sky is falling, his assumption is that actually he's ascending. And both of them are correct. Both of them are correct. They have the same activities going on in the physical universe, and what we discover is that we have the opportunity to give all the meaning it has to everything we experience. It's the idea of the observer observed, which is a powerful, important idea called complementarity in physics. This is not a metaphysical idea alone, but we have the opportunity to assign the meaning to what goes on in the world. Things happen, and then we assign that meaning, and we get to choose. It's part of free will, and we'll be talking about that as we go along. Now, although I've been a physicist for a long time, as you all realize, I have no credentials to talk to you about spirituality. But my good friend, Swami Beyondananda, pursued this with me. I was visiting him down at the ashram at Venice Beach and asked him, how can I address a big group on this subject? And he said, well, although you're certainly not a minister, I see looking at your aura that you were a minister in your previous life, so you can tell the people that you were preordained. So in the course of my talk, I will try and make sure that I keep my clown chakra open so we can all participate in the same field of farce and go on with the material that I actually have to describe. Probably the most important thing, or the most interesting thing that I can share with you is the idea of non-locality, which several other speakers have talked about. And I'll be describing this really as a physicist, no doubt telling you more than you want to know, but I want to give you the idea that non-locality is not a New Age metaphor for some weirdness that you experience on the astral plane. Non-locality is the most exciting thing in contemporary physics. It pertains to an observation that was made many thousands of years ago, and modern physics has finally caught up to it. The first time in modern science that we hear about non-locality was in 1934, when Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, three physicists at Princeton, noticed that quantum mechanics predicts that particles traveling away from each other, electrons or photons, remain connected. And Einstein called this a spooky connection at a distance, or a telepathic connection at a distance. Because Einstein knew all about telepathy, he wrote a very affirmative introduction to the mental radio book by Upton Sinclair. So Einstein was well acquainted with psychic stuff and sympathetic, but he wasn't sympathetic to it in physics. So he felt that this apparent connection between things traveling away from each other at the speed of light, he felt that that connection showed that quantum mechanics could not be right, because it implied you could send a signal between these two photons that were traveling away from each other at the speed of light, and special relativity says that's impossible. So that's how the stage was set in 1934, and this is called the EPR paper, the EPR paradox. How do these photons know what each other are doing, receding from each other at the speed of light? In 1968, two scientists, Friedman and Clauser at UC Berkeley, demonstrated that the photons were in fact correlated with one another. And this was a laboratory benchtop experiment. And people said, well, those photons are pretty close to each other, and you're turning the polarizers by hand. Then a decade later, Aste at the University of the Sorbonne in Paris did a similar experiment where he electronically turned the polarizer for one branch of the light at a time fast compared with the movement of the photons. So the polarizer was turned before the photon could move very far at all. And these photons were again correlated. And then in recent years, Giessen at Geneva has done experiments with photons that are many, many kilometers apart. So the experiment that is most exciting today sounds a lot like an ESP experiment. You've got twin photons. It's like twins reared apart, born together, reared apart. The twin photons are born in Geneva. One goes to Zurich and one goes to Basel. This is tens of kilometers. You turn a polarizer in Basel, and the guy in Zurich notices that his photons are still correlated with the ones in Basel 20 kilometers away. Now, to tell you why this is important, for a mild-mannered physicist sitting at his table is doing experiments, and the photons come down the line from the central laboratory, it greatly troubles the physicist to know that the photons that he's looking at are being affected by somebody across the country doing some other experiment in some other laboratory using different photons. This is what's called a non-local interaction, and is the most interesting thing going on in physics today. It shows that we live in a quantum interconnected universe, a non-locally connected universe. Now, it's important to understand, I'm not saying that the EPR photon experiment is the explanation of ESP. EPR is not the explanation for ESP. But the fact that we live in a non-local interconnected universe is a perfect description of what we see in the laboratory. It fits the data exquisitely. The fact that we can look into a sealed box and describe the color of the rose in the box, even though that color is not yet manifest, shows that our consciousness fills all the space and time, can see the future that we will experience at a later time, can see into the distance, and this distant seeing has been described for millennia. The oldest teaching we know about, pre-Buddhist, pre-Hindu, is called Advaita Vedanta. Advaita means not two. It's like not zwei in German. Advaita is the oldest spiritual teaching, and it comes from India, of course, and it's before the Vedas, so we're talking thousands of years before, 2,000 or 3,000 years before Christ. Mystics sitting quietly on a rock, peacefully on a rock, noticed that the most important thing that they had to communicate is that we are connected to one another in consciousness. Our consciousness is connected to other consciousness in nature, and that the apparent division is apparent and not real. And of course, in Hinduism, we talk about Brahman. The idea of Brahman is congruent to our idea of non-locality. It's very amazing. Again, with no data, the mystics on a rock would say the universe is Brahman. It's filled with consciousness, it's undivided, and we participate in that consciousness.
core teaching in Hinduism is that Atman equal Brahman. That is, our consciousness, our self-awareness is congruent, is one with all that is in the physical universe. Sounds very much like non-locality, sounds very much like remote viewing. And this is the core spiritual teaching, that there is no separation. Millennia later, the Buddhists came along and said, separation is an illusion. Whenever you make a distinction, you make a mistake. It's the basic Buddhist idea of attachment, that that separation is the cause of suffering. That when you make a distinction, since there are no distinctions, whenever you make a distinction, you create suffering generally for yourself. And it's this connection pervading all of metaphysical thought. That is the mystic Christians, the mystical Christians, Gnostic Christians, and Thomas Keating today teaches that our consciousness is transcendent. The Jewish Kabbalists, the followers of Islam, the Sufis, the Hindus, and the Buddhists, all of the major mystical traditions completely agree that we are one in consciousness. There is one God, there is one experience of love, there is one transcendent experience in which we can participate. And this participation does not require you to believe anything. The modern scientist would rather be in endless suffering and desperation than believe anything silly. For scientists, silliness is worse than death. But what I'm describing here is a kind of participatory, experiential spirituality that is available and does not require you to believe anything. It's a scientific experiment. And it's sort of the sit down and shut up spiritual path that's described essentially in those details and those words in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is talking to Krishna, the Son of God, God manifest in the Bhagavad Gita, and he's telling Arjuna, who's worried about being killed in the field of battle, you don't have to read the Vedas, you don't have to read the Upanishads. If you would just sit down and be quiet, you will notice that I'm always with you. So even in the holy book, in the Bhagavad Gita, God is telling the reluctant warrior, you don't have to read any of this stuff, you just have to be quiet. The opening lines in Patanjali, who talks about psychic abilities, is that union with God is mind wave quieting. When I first read this, when it was first translated for me, what it said, what I understood is that if you quiet your brain waves, you can experience God. And this is pretty amazing, written 2,400 years ago. I didn't know that they understood about brain waves then. But the opening line is that yoga is mind wave quieting. And then Patanjali goes on to tell you that when you quiet your mind, you have the opportunity to look into the distance, look into the future, heal the sick, diagnose the sick, and participate in all these other psychic abilities, which are called siddhis. But he cautioned that there's no powers before liberation. And it's the idea that all of these interesting psychic things that are available give you a clue that you're finally beginning to stop your mind chatter, but it's just more phenomena. It's a stumbling block on the way to transcendence. In the Sutras of Patanjali, this is all a long time ago, this is 400 years before Christ. In the Sutras of Patanjali, which you can buy at your local bookshop, he's telling you that these metaphysical, these psychic experiences are available, but it's just phenomena as a stumbling block on your path to transcendence. Patanjali has written a little rule book on what you do to experience God, what you do to experience His transcendent opportunity for peacefulness and expansion. This is all very old stuff. We think that we've invented remote viewing. We think that we've invented non-locality, but direct knowing was the source of all this information 2,500 years ago. Now, the fact that what we're describing sounds so close to what Herodotus describes with the oracles foretelling what Pharaoh had done, and what Patanjali describes as the path to psychic abilities and transcendence. The fact that we are now experiencing what these Dharma masters of thousands of years ago, what they described, makes us feel that we're probably on the right track. And it's just important not to stumble over the physical manifestations that we love, which is the various kinds of remote viewing, spoon bending, looking into the future, and these other delightful phenomena. We're going to notice them. It's an opportunity to incorporate them in their lives. Just don't get that attached to them. If somebody asks who you are, I recommend you find some other thing to say than I'm a remote viewer. What remote viewing, the gift of remote viewing, is that we are able to describe and experience what's going on in distant places, blocked from us by space and time. That's the gift of remote viewing. It's been demonstrated now in our frame of reference for 30 years, since Hal Puthoff and I started the SRI program in 1972. All over the world, people have found the remote viewing protocol very easy and interesting to pursue. But the gift of remote viewing is that you have the opportunity also to investigate who you are yourself. And what you discover is that we are individually a center of awareness. That we are more than a body, obviously, since in remote viewing, your own little center of awareness is able to transcend space and time, move wherever you wish, through space and through time, and describe what's there. Obviously, your body's not going with you. So when you say, who is going, you have to reflect on who you might be. And this is, again, a millennial-old path called self-inquiry, where you investigate who you are yourself. I think this is one of the more interesting uses of remote viewing. It's investigating inner space and outer space with the tools that we've already developed. This kind of self-inquiry allows you to notice that you are a center of awareness and not a physical body. We have physical bodies, but as soon as you think you are this body, that's a great source of suffering. Bodies are a great source of suffering in society, principally from advertising. I mean, the purpose of advertising is to make us suffer. That's the whole reason that advertising is created, to create needs that don't otherwise exist, to make you feel that your physical body is not corresponding to some impossible ideal. Advertising is designed to make us break the most imaginative of all the 10 commandments. One commandment is different from all the other, and that's not the one you think. The 10th commandment says that you shouldn't covet, and that's a commandment about thought rather than doing. And the purpose of advertising is to make you break that commandment, to make you want stuff, to make you want bodies. And what you discover as you get in touch with your own spirituality and your own awareness and an idea of who you might be, that physicality becomes less interesting. For example, at this conference, well-intentioned, nice people have wanted to talk to me about using remote viewing for spying and espionage, looking into what other companies are doing, forecasting the stock market and silver futures, solving murders, getting to the mind of the murderer so we can find out who did the crime. There are all sorts of interesting applications that are worth doing. It's not what I want to do anymore, but it's a kind of application that is off the mark for what somebody who is on a spiritual path finds interesting. It's hard to explain this in a believable way, because when my co-author Jim, Catherine, and I wrote our first book together, which is Miracles of Mind, it's what does a spiritual healer have to say to a psychic spy, basically. And in writing that book, our publisher said, if you people are telling folks how to do remote viewing, you really should do some remote viewing, do a demonstration. So we set out an experiment together with Jeffrey Mishlove and 2 other scientists. And Jane and I forecast silver futures for a dozen weeks. And we were correct in 11 out of 12 of our forecasts. And that was very exciting. That says that even 2 inexperienced viewers, I'm very experienced as a facilitator, but not so much as a viewer. But our position is that if you do remote viewing correctly, you should be right a very good percentage of the time. And we were right 11 out of 12 calls for silver. And then there was great excitement in our little community that let's go into the market. We can replicate your earlier experiment. In the 80s, we did a series of 9 silver experiments and made more than $100,000. We were 9 for 9 correct. That was a source of great celebration in the Wall Street Journal and Nova and so forth. But Jane and I, who had now written 2 books on psychic abilities and the spiritual path, it simply did not feel good to us to use our remote viewing ability to make money in the market. We didn't think it was bad. We're happy to help people do that, but it was simply not the way we wanted to use that ability. It just didn't feel to us like a direction that we wanted to pursue. And we thought that was a quite interesting change in our perspective, because all of us would like to make money, especially with not too much work. So it seemed intellectually like an attractive thing to do, but experientially, that's not what we wanted to do with our consciousness anymore. So what really happened to me is that in running the SRI program with Hal Puthoff and Ed May and Ingo Swan, it was Swan, of course, who taught us how to do remote viewing, I had the opportunity to sit in the dark for a decade. So it's as though I was a psychic spy for the CIA and found God, because the CIA made it possible for me to sit in the dark and learn how to facilitate psychic ability, how to help other people get in touch with a part of themselves that's psychic. In 1980, we had 8 Army recruits, including Mel Riley and Joe McMoneagle, came to our lab, and I sat with each of those 6 people and showed them how to do remote viewing. And we had and that was of course very successful, and we had a statistically significant result with the 6 people. And the effect size was neighborhood of 0.6. That is, the number of standard deviations divided by the square root of the number of trials was greater than 0.6. Now, the reason this is important, and it's like time out for a little math, is that psychic ability, remote viewing should be working very well. If you do 100,000 trials and find that you've got great significance, it's probably because you did 100,000 trials and not because you had a lot of ESP. We typically would do 6 or 9 trials and get results of 1,000 to 1 or 10,000 to 1. If you find that you're having to do tens of thousands of trials to get significance, you're probably doing something the matter with your protocol. The experiment that Jane and I just did for our book was effect size of 0.6, and I just came back from a week in Italy, the end of last year, where I was invited to teach 24 healthcare professionals how to do remote viewing to people who had never done anything like this. It was all done through a translator. And I have a handout, free preprint, sitting up with my books at the bookstore here, which you're welcome to pick up. I have about 50 or 60 of them. And what we describe is how each of these 24 people had their own picture to describe. So we had 3 hours of propaganda about remote viewing, 3 hours of meditation, which Jane led, 3 hours of training describing little objects, and then a 2-hour formal experiment where each of the 24 people was guided by her partner, and her partner would interview her, say, what are you experiencing, what does it look like, what do you feel? And then the partner would come up to the front of the room, and armed only with the viewer's description, the partner had to decide which of 4 pictures was the right one. And then she would bring that correct one back to the viewer. And since there are 4 pictures, you would expect 1 and 4 to be correct, or you would expect 6 out of 24 first place matches. And we got 14 out of 24 first place matches, which is significant at about 1 out of 5,000. Now this is a very speedy, this is a 2-hour experiment. And it has effect size of about 0.65 again. So just to remind you what this effect size stuff is, we had about 3 standard deviations from chance, which would be odds of 1 in 1,000. 3 standard deviations. And we had about 25 people. So the square root of 25 is 5, as you may remember. So if you divide 3 by 25, you get 0.6. That's how you can calculate the effect size. So the purpose of this whole story is to encourage people who are teaching remote viewing to do formal double-blind experiments. It doesn't take long. We did this study with 24 people. It took 2 hours to do the experiment, explain it through an Italian translator, and judge it. The whole thing took 2 hours to do. We had an effect size of 0.6. The odds are better than 1,000 to 1, and it's a publishable paper which we publish. I think that it is essential that people who are doing remote viewing training write up and publish formal double-blind experiments, because my problem as a non-trainer is that people call me all the time and say, where should I go to learn how to do remote viewing? And I am good friends with all the trainers, and as a scientist, I have no way to judge, to determine where to send people, because for some reason, up until today, nothing's been published. So this is my pitch. Next year, the remote viewing trainers will try very hard to present data for the remarkable success of their students in formal double-blind trials. So next year, you'll have data from people other than me about how well remote viewing can work, how easy it is, and how people have learned to do it. This is not rocket science. This is extremely easy to do. So remote viewing is our ability to inflow this information. The other side of this, Larry Dawsey described in some detail yesterday, is distant healing, where we have the opportunity to outflow our intention. The evidence for outflowing of our intention is very strong. Marilyn Schlitz and Leonard and William Broad have been doing this for more than a decade at Mind Science Foundation, where people would be able to prevent the breakdown of blood cells by focusing their attention on these little sanguineous corpuscles and keep them from breaking up in the distilled water. And they were even more successful at preserving the blood cells if they were their own blood cells. This is simply by focusing their attention and trying to help the little blood cells, which presumably don't have a lot of consciousness. And the staring experiments are now done all over the world, where we find that if you stare at the video image of a person, their galvanic skin response and heart rate change during the moments when you stare at them. And a correlate that's quite interesting is that the more shy the person is, the more defended the person is, the greater the effect of being stared at. So you have an independent correlation, which makes it seem like quite a real experiment. And in the healing experiments, we now have 3 published clinical double-blind trials. One that has been described by a number of people, the one my daughter Elizabeth Targ did, psychiatrist at California Pacific Medical Center, where experienced healers all over America prayed for half of her AIDS patients, and the patients for whom prayers were said had better medical outcomes, fewer opportunistic illnesses, fewer trips to the hospital, and better quality of life. And these were highly successful experiments. And she again worked with experienced healers, people that had been doing healing for a decade. The two other studies were done by, and this was published in the Western Medical Journal, the two other studies were done by cardiac surgeons, Randolph Bird at San Francisco General Hospital and William Harris at St. Louis Hospital. Both cardiac surgeons worked with hundreds and hundreds of patients, but inexperienced healers. So again, the effect size rears its ugly head. Bird's study and Harris's study were as significant as Elizabeth's, but they had to have 30 or 40 times more patients because the healers were not experienced. Elizabeth's healers had been doing healing for a decade, and what you can imagine is that nobody is going to be a healer for 10 years unless it's working for you. So her healers were practiced and successful. So Elizabeth's effect size was about 10 times greater than the two cardiac surgeons doing similar work. But the fact that you have papers published now in the Southern Medical Journal and the Annals of Internal Medicine is itself a paranormal event. That you have 3 mainstream medical journals that have now published papers about psychic abilities. Now, with the outflow of healing intent and the inflow of remote viewing, the stage is set for us to find out who we are. Because between the inflow of our remote viewing images and the outflow of our healing intent is a quiet place where we can reside. Because once you've learned to do remote viewing or distant healing, you have obviously learned to control your mental chatter. You've learned to quiet the rattling mind waves that potentially talked about. So between the inflow and the outflow, within this quiet place, you have the opportunity to find out who you are. You have the opportunity to reside in the remarkable loving place that the mystics have talked about for millennia. So this is not about believing in God. This is an opportunity to quiet your mind so that you can reside in this loving syrup, in these oceanic feelings. See, the oceanic feelings are feelings in which you feel that you are one with the universe, one with all that is. Very much like the expanded awareness of remote viewing. Remote viewing equals expanded awareness. We have that ability. And what we can do with that ability is our choice. You can use that for a kind of self-inquiry and discover that the optimists that I was talking about have an opportunity to reside in love. Now, Jesus described this as the peace that passes understanding. I have a teacher who was an American woman educated in India, and she spent a lot of time in a meditative state. And her teacher said, well, what are you experiencing? She says, there's no words for what I'm experiencing. This is beyond the ability to describe. And he said, that's very good. Now teach that. So all of these descriptions always come back to the idea of being in love. Now, I know it's hard to believe this is beyond boyfriends and girlfriends. This is love as a place to reside rather than something to do. In the Christian terminology, it was said that God is love. And I, of course, grew up not as a Christian, and I always thought that Christians say God is love just to annoy the non-believers. Because that idea is never unpacked. It's never explained. What could that mean? You know that that's something that's described in the Pauline letters and throughout the New Testament, but you never get an idea of what that could actually mean. And it's in the Vedic literature that you get the idea that love is a place to reside, that this peace that passes understanding is a place where we can live during our day-to-day activity, and we have that choice. See, what's choiceless is who we are. That you have no choice over the fact that you're inherently a spiritual being, that you have the expanded awareness, that you have the opportunity for these experiences. That's who you are. There's no choice about that. What you have a choice about is whether you're going to accept that or continue doing something else, and we all have choice about how we're going to deal with it. Now, there's no conflict between this kind of spirituality and science. The big thing that's happening in this decade is that principally physicists, there's a big rush of new books by scientists who have discovered that there is not a conflict between science and spirituality. In fact, there's a multitude of conferences, one a month this year, on science and spirituality. And what is observed is that the spiritual practice is a activity that one can participate in and experience, and it does not require you to believe a thing. It's like a laboratory experiment that says, we have a practice, and that can be self-inquiry that was brought to us by Ramana Maharshi in recent times, asking who you are and then who wants to know. This is a fast track to getting inside yourself, called self-inquiry. There's also Vipassana meditation, insight meditation, which is also very, very effective, widely used. My opinion is that it's an effective but slower track, but is well understood for people who like step-by-step instructions. All of these things are like a lab experiment. Here's a description of what you can do. Try this experiment, go do the practice, come back, write up your lab report, and let me know what happened. It doesn't require you to believe anything. There's no silliness involved, no belief involved. It's an experience. So it brings us to the beginning of the 21st century, and it appears that God is a testable hypothesis. It does not require the poor scientist to give up his science. There's hope for the scientist, that is, he can discover that he is more than a activated machine, that he does have a spiritual nature, and he can discover that without having to believe anything silly. It doesn't always bring him the peace of mind that he's looking for, however, because advertising creates needs, and we keep looking for the answer to our needs, the right partner, the right house, the right job, the right way to get money. The Buddhists talk about emptying yourself. And I recently was at a conference with Ram Dass. At the end of an 8-day, it seemed like 8 days, at the end of an 8-hour meditation with Ram Dass and a bunch of teachers, Ram Dass finally said, if you can't remember anything else that I've told you here, just remember empty, empty, happy, happy. And I described that to a good friend of mine, an extremely intelligent mathematician, a good friend. He said, what's wrong with full, happy, happy? And here we are in prosperous Silicon Valley. I really don't do this empty stuff. And what I was able to tell him is that the full experiment has been done, and it doesn't work. We know about the full experiment, and it is of the form, we're looking for happiness on the material plane. We're looking for partners, houses, money, stuff, and we then remodel the houses. Instead of remodeling the mess that's inside, we remodel the houses. And when I was working at Lockheed, what I noticed is that there was a range of experience that goes from fear to desperation. And that's where people reside. And the disrespectfulness that is endemic in aerospace, those people reside in fear. They wake up in the morning and they're fearful. They're fearful about trying to do their projects that don't have enough money, don't have enough time. They're fearful about money to pay their mortgages, pay their college tuition. and they simply wake up in fear, and that's the direction that their day goes, and the meaning in their life is absent. And what I've observed is that we have a choice as to how we do our day. You can wake up, if you're paying attention, in my opinion, you wake up in gratitude because you've awakened. And you're living in a peaceful place, and you have some intelligence. And you have the interesting opportunity is that you can wake up in grace. You can wake up in gratitude for your great good fortune, or you can wake up and fall into the fearful pit that's by the side of your bed. It's like a chaotic attractor. You step out of bed and you slip into this familiar path of how am I going to do all the things I have to do. I'm very familiar with that. Or you can wake up saying thank you, and you get to choose. And you can choose the kind of day that you want to experience. You can reside in love during your day, and people will be very surprised to find you there because they're in desperation and you're in the same place. How can you be in love and they're in desperation? Are you going nuts? The idea is a very Buddhist idea, a very physics-oriented idea, that you have a chance to give all the meaning it has to what you're experiencing. Things just happen and you give it experience. And you give it meaning. In physics, this complementarity says that if you're looking at light, for example, light comes in from a star, and you have a prism, and you let the light fall into your prism, and it spreads out in the beautiful colors, and light is exactly awake. There is nothing else visible but this beautiful light wave that spreads out. Somebody else comes along, and what he has is a photodetector, like an exposure meter. He holds this exposure meter in front of the starlight, and it goes click, 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 and he counts the photons one by one that comes in, and he says, there's no wave here. I'm counting particles. I've got 10 million of them so far. What do you mean it's a wave? So yeah, and this is contemporary. This is modern. This is where modern physics is right now, and we call it complementarity. It says that it's what you observe is an interaction between the experimenter and the phenomenon. It's the observer observed, and you have an opportunity to give the meaning to what you observed from what you brought to the experiment. And it's this opportunity to give your experience meaning that changes your whole experience of what goes on in the world. Now, the idea that I want to leave you with is you have this interesting search for God, the search for spiritual experience. You could say you have a smart man like Carl Sagan. He's written many, many books about how the universe is put together and how he has searched all over, he's turned over every rock, and he hasn't found God anywhere. His last book, The Demon-Haunted Universe, I guess it's a demon-haunted world. He said, I've looked at flying saucers, crop circles, alien abductions, and God, and I find it all incoherent. So the question is, why couldn't Carl Sagan find God? There's a very simple answer, and that is, he couldn't be quiet. So the secret path to having that experience is that you have to be quiet. So I will, since we're running late, I will leave you with the idea that these experiences are available. I invite the remote viewers to please do controlled experiments. And I want the rest of you to be in love. Thank you.
thing with it, then there's no attachment. However, if you did a material thing with your gift to the city, then it becomes something.
It is.
You repeat the question?
Question is about everybody's favorite question. Everybody wants to make money with remote viewing. In the literature, in the mystical literature, there's the idea that God won't let you make money with psychic abilities. That's why people have not in general been making money with psychic abilities. That idea is false. I've made a lot of money with psychic abilities, but what happens, in my opinion, is by the time you get good at making money with remote viewing or psychic abilities, you discover that's not what you want to do anymore. It's possible to do, but by the time you have gotten enough control of your own mental processes so that you can do that, you find you want to do something different.
Well, you may want to do spiritual things with your mind. That was my point.
That's a possibility. My experience, speaking for one, is that I simply don't want to go into the mind of the murderer. I don't want to have to deal with Wall Street. It's not where I want to occupy my mind space. But that might just be me. Yes?
How do you mentioned photons a bunch of times. How do you believe that the presence of photons and remote viewing relate to each other?
What do photons have to do with remote viewing? I think photons have absolutely nothing at all to do with remote viewing. I gave the example of what Jane and I describe as the object in the box trick, which is where somebody will bring us a box and we then either describe what's in the box or we show somebody else how to describe what's in the box. And colors, for me in particular, colors are a very, very reliable thing to in my remote viewing transcripts, which look a little bit like the CRV practice, I will write down all the things I'm experiencing, and then when I'm done, I'll make a summary. Which of these 3 pages should you believe? What's analytical overlay here? What's mental noise? What's imagination? What's analysis? And what's true? How do you get rid of the mental noise? What I can usually count on is the colors. And the colors are obviously not manifest in the remote viewing, because the remote viewing object is in a box. There are no photons in a box. So what I'm describing is this beautiful green object with iridescent blue ends in a place where there's no photons at all. Those colors don't manifest until the future when I get handed the object. So the reason I'm talking about photons is because it's photons that are used in these exquisite experiments describing the non-locality of the space we live in, but I don't think photons have anything at all to do with psychic abilities. I think our consciousness transcends the ordinary four-dimensional space-time that physicists have been talking about to have direct access to the thing you're describing in a apparently distant place. I think there is no distance in remote viewing.
So you don't, the speed of light or anything, none of that's a factor.
Well, no, I'm going to do those experiments with identical twins. My next experiment is to observe the interaction between identical twins, which I think are metaphorically and probably physically like the twin photons. That is, the twins who are born apart and separated wind up still in phase with each other, doing remarkably correlated things. Scientific American has a picture of two men who were separated at birth, brought together. They're both wearing the same blue chambray shirt, steel rim glasses, mustache, and fireman's hat because they both are fire chiefs on opposite sides of the country. I do not believe we have fireman genes.
Because some people will be leaving today, we really need to stick to the schedule. So if you have any further questions, if you could ask Russ on a personal basis, that would really help the day flow along.
And what I'll say is that the two books I have outside, one is about remote viewing and the CIA program, and the other one is why bother with remote viewing? What comes next after you learn to do remote viewing? Part of the mind.